Hello and welcome to another episode of the Young Tongues podcast. My name is Barbara Fountain and I'm the founder and CEO of the Young Tongues, a peer-to-peer support group for young tongue cancer patients across the globe. And I am absolutely delighted to have a guest with me today, Elizabeth Marsh. I welcome you. Let's kick this straight off. We like to get to know people a little bit beyond the profession. Do you mind introducing yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, of course. I am Dr Elizabeth Marsh. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's so lovely to see you again, Barbara. I am an associate professor of molecular and cellular biology, and my research interest is in human papillomavirus and how it causes head and neck cancer. But yeah, that's my work persona. I have other things as well. I have two beautiful little girls. I live in Derbyshire. I've got such a stunning view out of my window here. I wish you could see it. So we head out into the peaks as often as we can, going walking and camping out there. As much outside activity as possible. Oh,
that sounds amazing. So for anyone listening who's not come across a research professor before, let alone someone who's a professor in, is it biomedical science and human biology? Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what it said on the website. So, so how would you describe what you do?
So I would describe myself as a basic scientist, which has been criticised before because there is, I suppose, nothing basic about what I do. But we are, we're classified as basic scientists, which basically means that I am not clinical. So I'm not a doctor. I'm not a medically trained professional at all. I'm interested in what happens in the cell, really. And of course, say in the context of my work, that cell has become infected with the virus HPV. And I try to understand what happens in that cell and what happens in the tissue around that cell and bringing things in like the immune system and so on. But trying to kind of dissect all the particulars, so different genes, different proteins that are involved in that. So it's all on a very, very tiny scale. And know people.
But I guess in essence, what makes us human in that sort of sense? What makes us biologically human? Biologically human. Yeah. And how did you get into that? I mean, did you leave school and go like, I'm really into figuring out what's happening in the body, or?
It's a complete accident, really. I did want to be a medical doctor. That was the intention. My dad was a medical doctor, and I very much wanted to follow him. But I didn't get the A-level grades I needed to go to medical school. So I took a gap year and I did a bit of travelling and I did a bit of voluntary work, which was awesome. And then I went to university to study biology with a view of then doing the 4-year graduate medical course at the end of it. And within weeks, I was in love with that basic biology, with that fundamental biology, and what was happening on this subcellular level, and so it just went from there. So yeah, medicine went straight out the window.
You found your love.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then I did an extended research project in my final year with a supervisor who then became my PhD boss, because I applied to stay with him and continue that work. And he's been instrumental in my life and my career. And then I did a postdoc, and that's where I first properly encountered human papillomavirus, I suppose.
Yeah, speaking of, how did you encounter the HPV and what drew you to it? What did you find really interesting to go, oh, actually, I want to continue researching this?
I had always wanted to be a family planning doctor. That had been my interest when I was applying for medicine and doing all of that sort of thing. And I know that it's one of the questions that you've got planned for later on. HPV is sexually transmitted, and I there was already an instant connection there because of that. And I invited scientist. She's a scientist, to come and talk at a conference that I was organising at Birmingham, and her work was just super cool. So I tried to get a job with her, and
amazing.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
And then that opened the door to HPV.
Yeah. So let's take a step backwards for anyone listening, and maybe let's start at the very basics. How would you define what the human papillomavirus is?
So it's not a single entity, it is a number of things. It is a group of viruses. There are about 200 of them. And they are ubiquitous, which means that they are everywhere. So we will all encounter these viruses at some point in our lives. They are the same viruses that cause verrucas on our feet when we've been swimming, and warts on our hands as youngsters. But there are a small number of them, so about 14 of them, that are known as high-risk viruses. And these are the viruses that can cause cancer.
Mm-hmm. And one of the most common questions we come about is, how do people get infected with these high-risk HPV strains? Because there seems to be a lot of different debates about how that is possible, and a varying degree. What is the scientific answer to that from your community?
There is no getting away from the fact that they are sexually transmitted, those high risk types. So these are types that like these sort of mucosal structures in our body, so nice sort of moist layers of skin that are a sort of a particular sort of skin, really, I suppose is perhaps the easiest way of describing it. So classically, that would be the cervix, the structure of the cervix, and there's all sorts of other things that mean that the cervix is one of the main targets of this virus. I mean, that's not to say that the virus is able to go, find the cervix. It's just there. It will be on fingers, on skin. As I said, the virus is ubiquitous, but when it encounters a cell that it can infect, and that is, if you think of skin as a sort of sorry, you can't see my other hand, as a multi-layered structure that is protective for our body, it wants to get down to these layers, this layer of skin at the very bottom, this layer of cells at the very bottom of the skin, called the basal cells. And so it can get in through small holes in that skin layer, sort of abrasions that just happen naturally, and the virus is then able to attach to those basal cells and infect those basal cells and establish an infection in those basal cells. But those structures are also in our mouths, particularly at the base of our tongue, and in our tonsils, we will all encounter these viruses when at sexual debut, really. They can also be transmitted from mother to child through childbirth, but all of that is caveated because it's so difficult, isn't it? HPV sort of, unfortunately, through its very nature, apportions blame and stigma, and I think it's really hard to get away from that, because we can all encounter them. They are everywhere.
Yeah, and I guess it's different to other sexually transmitted disease in the sense that there are no immediate side effects, like there's no rash or you wouldn't know that you have it. And also, I guess also, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the fact that actually a big percentage of the population have HPV and various strains of HPV, even though the cancerous strains are less common than the other strains.
It's so I think the statistic is that we will encounter an HPV infection, or rather 80% of the population will encounter an HPV infection at some point during their lives. And that can just be bad luck. You know, that there's nothing sort of associated with that in any way. I mean, but just that yeah, it might be that just that partner had an infection at that time. But there's some really interesting work that's looking at those sorts of that prevalence of those strains and things, and the thing, again, one of the exciting questions that you want to ask me later about the current research, what do I find really interesting, and for me that's around the vaccine, because of course we can prevent this, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what data that is coming out of Scotland are one of the world leaders at doing this, and they have shown this year that not only in their cohort of vaccinated females have they not had any cases of cervical cancer, but that actually they are removing the vaccine strains, the viral types that are in that vaccine are being removed from the vaccinated population. So
wow.
That's phenomenal. That's such exciting work.
So in plain English, I'm just translating.
Sorry,
that would mean no, don't worry. That would mean that having the vaccine doesn't just prevent the HPV infection from triggering a disease or from activating,
so
but actually
your body then is primed to attack that virus
But when you have the vaccine, they found evidence that it actually removes any HPV infection that might already be there, or
not in terms of be there from say yourself, but that is being circulated in the population, that we are beginning to lose those strains from that circulation.
Oh wow! So yes, okay, I think I got it now. So like the overall prevalence of these HPV strains actually is reduced within that population.
Exactly that.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, I think before we continue on, because I have, like, just from this small conversation, I have so many questions.
I'm so sorry.
No, don't worry. That's what we're here for. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to lean back on the questions that we've collected from within the Young Tongues community. Absolutely. Before we do that, I just think it's really important that we just remind, so not all tongue cancer is caused by HPV, and the predominant amount of our small community is cavity tongue cancer, which there's been some research out there to say that the figures are a little bit up there because they seem to be changing, but the last one I read was that only 10% of cavity tongue cancer seems to be HPV positive and 90% HPV negative. And we know that within our community, most of us have our tumours tested for HPV after it's been removed. So most people listening will know if they have an HPV positive or an HPV negative status. So on that note, let's get started. We had a question in from Jessica Helena. How many strains of HPV are there? Which strains cause cancer? And do these strains differ in the type of cancer they cause?
So there are over, well, again, it varies, like you said, depending on what you read, around 200 different types of HPV, of which 14 are known to cause cancer. And then there are some other possible, probable cancer-causing types on top of that as well.
Mm-hmm. Which are still being researched, I assume.
Yeah, not absolutely clear whether they really do, or perhaps they assist in it. You know, that sort of, can we really attribute disease to those viruses? And then in terms of the sort of cancer that they cause, no, not really. For sort of, to go back to what I was saying a bit earlier about those structures being kind of common across the body, and that's why those viruses are able to replicate and so on at those sites. So genital urinary tracts, and then the head and neck as well.
But also anal and
anal cancers, vulval cancers, vaginal cancers, cervical cancers, and head and neck cancers. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so quite a breadth of different areas, really.
Absolutely, and there are HPVs also cause other disease that is not cancer. So I had mentioned verrucas and warts. I mean, that's still a burden of disease, but also genital warts, those aren't caused by the cancer-causing types, and they can cause papillomas of the respiratory tract as well, sometimes in children, but also actually in adults, and that those warts in the throat, if you like, can grow and block airways. So there is a range of diseases that these viruses can cause. Yeah.
So Erica Hensdell, sorry if I mispronounced that. If a person had HPV, but the high-risk cancer strains were ruled out, is it possible that tongue cancer could be from a non-high-risk strain? She put in the notes that she's had lateral tongue normal PAPs for 9 years. PAPs meaning smear tests. Yeah.
Well, screening tests.
Or screening, yeah.
So it depends a little bit on what the test was that the hospital have done. It might have been that they tested just for HPV-16, which is the most common viral type in head and neck cancer. It might be that they have tested for HPV-16 and 18, which are together the most common cancer-causing viral types. And if they've ruled those out, then it would be, they would sort of have said that it was negative for those two viral types. But there are still a number of other viruses that it could cause. Or rather that it could be. So perhaps it's another high-risk type, or perhaps it's one of those possible high-risk types that I mentioned, that for whatever reason, depending on the test that has been used, they've been unable to give a sort of a categorical type
answer. Yeah, absolutely. And Jessica added a second question, and she said, I hear HPV can clear up on its own, in air marks, for some people. Why is this the case? Does it truly go away, or is it just lying dormant? Is this why an exam, a pap smear or a smear test, may show up as HPV positive, but the following year can be negative? Or are there such things as false positives? So a lot of questions in one question.
A lot of questions in there. I might have to get you to repeat, Barbara. So,
yeah.
I make sure that I have.
So the first part is, I hear HPV can clear up on its own.
So
is that
yes,
the case?
Absolutely. So just from the sort of initial statistic that I gave you, and how much we encounter this virus, and we have a great defence system, right? First of all, we have that skin barrier, which is there and protecting us, which is fabulous. So number one, the virus might not be able to get in anyway. Number two, we then have an incredible immune system that is sort of multi-layered, that is able to jump in and start to defend against the infection and eliminate the virus. And even there are times when that sort of disease has started. Now that's not necessarily cancer, but sort of the products of the infection. And our bodies can kind of push back and go backwards, and the infections can kind of regress or resolve. So yes, it is absolutely true that our bodies can fight off these infections, but they do also lie dormant. So a negative smear. So we did talk about at the start, didn't we? The number of caveats that there are going to be in my answers, which might not be because actually now you just said that, I'm just going to hop in with a comment from Hannah, because I think it's around the same thing. She said, "Can you explain about the virus lying dormant?" So how does that? So it's a sneaky thing. It's evolved over centuries to be this infective agent, and a virus, it isn't dead, but neither is it alive. It's not capable to live by itself in, say, the way that a bacteria would. It needs us. It needs our bodies, and evolutionarily, all it wants to do is make copies of itself and go on and infect other people. That's the sort of drive. I'm making it sound like it has the concept of a brain.
Yeah, that's its objective of having a virus, basically.
So it doesn't want to cause cancer. That's a mistake, really. It uses its genes and its systems to overcome, again, those cellular defences that we have, in order to enable it to make more copies of itself and go on and infect other people. But so one of the ways that it can overcome those defences is just to maintain in those basal cells really, really low copy number. They're called episomes, which is the sort of the viral genome, the information, the genetic material of the virus, that enables it to hijack our bodies, our cells, and make those copies. It will exist or maintain in very, very low numbers of those viral copies per cell, which means that actually the body doesn't really notice it.
Okay, we don't send out any immune.
Exactly. It's like, hello,
virus,
yes.
So our body doesn't go and actively fight it because it doesn't know it's there. So that's
exactly. I mean, again, caveats. That is a simplistic way of suggesting it, but I think that's probably the easiest way of trying to explain this. And those infections there are able to persist. So whilst a screening test nowadays is so sensitive that it should pick up a viral infection if it's there, that could be because on at this particular point there is an active infection that and then you're tested a year later, and the body has responded to that. The immune system and has eliminated that infection, but in some instances, so again, I'm sorry, I keep jumping all over the place.
That's fine. It's science. It's fine.
It's not linear either. You can't do it in an ordered fashion. I just hope that what I'm saying makes some sort of sense.
I'm following, so that's all right.
That's positive. That's good. Thank you for checking in. But if we are encountering this virus as often as we are, then a lot more people would have cancer if we weren't able to fight that infection, right? And actually, those cancers are happening still reasonably rarely. That doesn't apply to your audience, of course, but in general, that is the situation. So we have pretty good defences.
Yeah.
But in some instances, that virus can persist. It can sort of lie dormant, undetected, And it's those persistent infections that are the ones that tend to cause cancer.
Yeah. So I'm just picking up on, we've had 2 questions about smear tests and pap scans. And I think before our diagnoses, we were familiar with HPV because of the lots of media surrounding it with cervical cancer. And I personally remember, when you get your letter back after a smear test, it will say no abnormal cells, or it will say abnormal cells detected. Those cells, are those basal cells that we mentioned, or is that just any type of?
So forgive me. So the cervical smear will take a sample of a lot of the cells, or a good number of the cells of the cervix, and that will be the basal cells all the way through, and the virus uncouples the epithelium, which is the skin, from its when it begins to form skin. When those basal cells form the skin, they should come out of cell cycle. And start to differentiate into the various layers of the skin, and the virus forces them to continue to divide. So we get sort of classical, a wart-like appearance, I suppose, and I think we can probably all visualise what that looks like, that sort of expansion within our skin.
Yeah.
So it will be a selection of all of those cells.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to. I'm skipping ahead because I can sort of remember the questions. It's Hannah with a follow-up question by Vicky. So Hannah asks, if you have an HPV positive tongue cancer, would a cervical smear also show as positive?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm trying to detect, are the two one and the same thing? Or are we actually talking about 2 very different types of HPVs and different types of infections?
We are not talking about very different types of HPVs. We're talking about effectively the same types of HPVs. HPV-16 is the most common in the head and neck, and HPV-16 is the most common in the cervix. But we are talking about very different types of disease. And I was very privileged to go a couple of weeks ago to the International Papillomavirus Conference, which was just brilliant to hear from some of the most eminent scientists working in this field, and I have thought it for a long time, but continually reiterated, is that we do not know what's happening in the head and neck. We know what's happening in the cervix, but we have this kind of classical progression through sort of SIN 1, SIN 2, SIN 3 to invasive cancer, and in fact we are so confident about HPV as the cause of cervical cancer that we don't even do look at those cells anymore, Barbara, and they will just look to see if HPV is there. And if it is, then they'll call you back, and if it isn't, then you're negative, and we'll see you again in kind of 3 to 5 years. In the head and neck, we've kind of made perhaps a little bit of an assumption that the disease is the same as we're seeing in the cervix, and time and again that's being shown not to be the case. But the basic science has got a lot of catching up to do. We know clinically, we're seeing you guys in hospital, but we don't really know what the virus is doing and how it's doing what it's doing.
Okay, so Vicky sort of sends like the logical next question you would ask, and she said, Vicky Harris asks, are we at more risk of cervical cancer because we've had an HPV base of tongue cancer?
It's a really, really tricky one to answer, and I'm not entirely sure if they know what the answer is yet. I sort of want to be supportive, but I mean, I just don't think I know enough either to kind of conclusively say anything.
And that's absolutely fine, because that's fine, because I think for us there's also something quite liberating by putting those questions out there, because these are the type of questions that actually are with patients every single day. These are the type of questions that go around in our brains and in our minds, and I appreciate that there might not scientifically be the type of questions that get answered through the research, but they are important questions for patients, and they will be, but it can also be that the answer to those questions just aren't there yet, and that's fine too.
And keep asking them, because we need patients to direct the research that we do, so that we answer the questions that you need the answers to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is an easy out for me, and a bit unfair, so apologies. But I mean, there sort of is that, again, to go back to the sexual transmission, that there is presumably that transmission route between the two sites. But I don't think that, conclusively, in terms of risk, that's been fully determined.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe there is an opportunity here as well, because from a data perspective, I don't know if we would be able to detect if it would show in data if someone's had cervical and oropharyngeal base of tongue cancer, and if there's been an increase or not. In our community, at least anecdotally speaking, we've not had anyone share with us that they've had both cervical cancer and base of tongue. If that's you now listening, then please let us know on the group. But as far as from the chatter on the group, we haven't come across that situation yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. But that sort of anecdotal evidence is meaningful. So let's start asking those questions.
Yeah.
Certainly, if you encounter a genital infection, first of all, then, and particularly if you are a woman, you are better at producing antibodies to a genital infection, which would then presumably be protective for an oral infection. But there are questions being asked about, if you encounter the oral infection first, is that protective the other way around?
Yeah, I'm going to ask a really unfair question, because I don't think you'll know the answer to this, but it's just popped into my mind. Do we know that if the site of infection is also the site of the cancer, or can we be infected? Do you know what I mean? Can we be infected genitally and develop tongue cancer, or the other way around?
So absolutely, the site of the infection is the site of the cancer.
Oh, that's it. That's really interesting. No one's ever told me that, and it's not something we've ever discussed. So I don't know if we're actually aware of that. That's really interesting. Thank you. I'm going to go back to the questions before I get too sidetracked. Sarah Margaret Boger asks, can certain hormone levels or cycles in women/men promote tumour growth in HPV positive tumours? Meaning, can an HPV positive tumour be stimulated to grow in the presence of certain hormones, either oral or genital?
So I think there is evidence that says that hormones are a big factor, and I mean, again, we're still sort of finding out about what's happening in the head and neck, but in the cervix there is a classical kind of two peak in infection prevalence, where you encounter that infection first of all as at sexual debut, and then of course we maintain those infections if they're dormant, or we are able to eliminate them through our immune system. And then there's a second peak of infections that may well be associated with menopause, or also potentially perhaps behavioural in terms of, say, new sexual partners, perhaps say after following a breakdown of a marriage or something of that instance. But yeah, the role of estrogen is quite well established in carcinogenesis and so on. So yeah, that's definitely a story. Again, I'm not sure it's been fully unpacked in the context of head and neck cancer, but in genital cancers much more so.
Yes, okay. That's yeah, well, again, sort of anecdotally, and I have to admit, I am not sure if HPV is a contributing factor in those cases that I'm thinking of, but I know that we have a handful of patients who were going through pregnancy whilst being diagnosed. Actually, quite a remarkable amount of numbers, seeing how small our community is. And one of the sort of key fears was that by being pregnant you have a high cell renewance, and if that was making the tumour they had grow faster and spread quicker. So there's no answer to that, by the way. This is just, again, anecdotally things that are being shared, and I mean, we all know that when we're pregnant all our hormones change and are different.
They do, and you're immune suppressed as well, because your body's trying not to reject the baby, which is sort of foreign in, wanting to say that nicely. So again, that may also be a role that in suppressing that immune response, that again the immune system isn't able to stay on top of things as well as much as it would have, perhaps.
Would have, absolutely.
So, yeah, all sorts of things there, crikey, gosh.
So we'll go on to Honey Strachan. She asks, when can we have the HPV vaccine up to? Is there a cut-off limit? There seems to be conflicting advice. Is there any point in having it after tongue cancer, or what age is sort of the cut-off limit?
So the idea is that it is that you have it prior to encountering the vaccine, which is encountering the virus, which is why we give it at that sort of age 12 kind of age. We can you can have it up to the age of 45, but that is not on the NHS. That's having to pay for it privately. It is now protecting against 9 different strains of the virus. So there is still a benefit of having it subsequently, because it would then offer you some protection against other strains that perhaps haven't yet been encountered. But that's a very difficult thing, and I wouldn't want to recommend it, because it's on the back of everybody's personal situation, and kind of what they can afford to do, which isn't right, but it is something that's worth bearing in mind. But I think vaccine wise, that one of the best things that we can do is just keep talking about how good it is, and how important it is for protecting not just against cervical cancer but against other HPV cancers.
Absolutely. We'll talk a bit more about the vaccine. Actually, there's another vaccine related question from Honey as well. How does this virus oh no, this isn't vaccine related at all. It's called virus. Sorry, I'll start again. Another V word. But we'll come back to the talking about the vaccine in a bit. But Honey also asks, how does this virus trigger? For example, if we improve our diet and lifestyle, will this affect the virus? It's a difficult one, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I guess I could help a bit by saying having a healthy lifestyle is good for is always good, and will prevent lots of different diseases. I guess I'll also put out there that I am highly sensitive to a lot of information on the old interweb about all sorts of nutritional advice, supplementary advice, lifestyle advice that makes incredibly credible claims that will somewhere along the text claim there was some sort of research done, but when digging down, finding it very difficult to find the original source or to make sure that it's a peer-reviewed type of research. So, but I also understand from especially the time when I was early diagnosed that you want to do everything within your power to make sure that you don't cause any more damage, or that you are helping your body fight whatever it needs to fight. Absolutely. And also that within to a view of the future. And I also wouldn't want to poo-poo any concrete research that is done in terms of nutrition or removing things from your lifestyle that might be negatively impacting health. And I don't like calling it cancer health, but health in general.
Absolutely. So I think you've worded it perfectly, Barbara. The virus will do its thing. Try to be as healthy as possible.
Mm-hmm. And I guess also with lifestyle, I'm just looking at the word as well, nutrition being one part. And, we have a big debate in our community about, I don't think any of us smoke. That is one thing that we all know. Alcohol is an interesting one. I got diagnosed on New Year's Eve, so obviously my first question was like, can I have a drink? I really need one. And they were like, yeah, you're fine. And actually the advice has been like, no, go and live your life. Like, don't consume alcohol to a huge extent. But then we also have been, other patients within our group are given completely different advice in terms of no, don't touch alcohol at all. And I guess a lot of that comes down to personal choice and what people feel most comfortable with. So again, I'm not going to make you answer that question, Elizabeth, but I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add.
There sort of HPV negative cancer is more strongly associated with smoking and alcohol. And I think that there is some work from the States that is pretty much conclusively, as confidently as they can be, saying that smoking and alcohol are not impacting HPV cancers, or certainly the incidence of cancer. Mm-hmm. Whether they then have a contribution to the progression of the disease is sort of another question, unfortunately. But in terms of those infections and that prevalence, that there isn't then an additional association with smoking and alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'm just going to feed in because I can hear people's voices going. Okay. No, because I just had the same reaction to it. I also have to just remind that we're not saying because you have an HPV negative cancer that it was caused by lifestyle choices. I know that is your opinion, but I just thought I'll spell that out. Because I noticed I'm incredibly sensitive, and I went to an event last week and was at a speech, and someone said something, and it really wasn't what I thought I heard, but I realised my back straight went up, and I was like, and then actually I was like, no, actually what they're saying is absolutely accurate. It's just, I guess when you're a young person and you don't fit the norm of the patient group, it's then really difficult to listen to speeches that are about the majority of the patient group. Anyhow, that's a sidebar. Let's go to Chloe. Chloe's got a brilliant question. Chloe Gower-Page. She asks, how accurate is HPV testing if cancer was on the mobile tongue and done with a stain/PCR test?
So I use the PCR test in my own work. The stain, it also depends on what they're staining for. So again, in the cervix, P16 is a very, very good marker for an HPV positive cancer, less so in the head and neck. It's reasonably good when the incidence of HPV positive cancer is quite high in say, the country, but it's not as good when that incidence is low. It's not the strongest predictor. So an alternative would be to look to see whether HPV DNA is there, and you can actually visualize that. There is a test that enables you to see the virus, which is pretty cool, really. That's a bit unfair of me, isn't it? But this is the kind of thing that turns me on. So I would say that if that test was positive, if that test was conducted and that test was positive, then you're very sensitive. The sensitivity is really high, and you can be very confident that that's the case. And the same with the PCR. They are pretty good tests, but they are not absolute. So that there is always a chance. But if they're doing, say, multiple ones, so like the PCR and also a staining, then that of course increases the likelihood.
So there are two ways to test for HPV, either by staining or, well, actually three: staining, PCR, and by how you said, animating it in the genome.
So looking to see if sort of markers of the virus are there, and P16 would be one of those. Looking to actually see if the virus is there itself, that viral DNA that you can detect. It's called a technique called in situ hybridization. It's very, very neat. And obviously these tests are getting better all the time, and people are introducing new ones and so on as well all the time that are coming to the market. And then a test by PCR, which is a molecular test. And again, it produces multiple copies of that viral DNA to a degree that we can then detect. Well, sort of visualize that. I suppose.
Visualize that.
But rather than looking at the tissue, you're looking at DNA that we've extracted from that tissue instead.
Absolutely. And I guess it's really important that there's actually protocols in place across different healthcare systems, because we've got a UK audience, but we also have a global audience, to make sure that the tumours are tested for HPV, so we can keep track of how many. I guess, hold on, I just remembered something, and it's not in any of our questions, so I can ask this question. I guess it will also inform our multidisciplinary team on next steps for treatment if required.
Absolutely. So at the moment, treatment is the same, whether you're HPV positive or negative, but there is quite a lot of work that is looking at de-escalating that treatment, which, as unfortunately you know, is utterly horrific, and those words don't even touch what you've experienced, right? That we know that people with an HPV positive cancer are responding better to treatment. So if there is the opportunity to de-escalate that safely, and it must be done safely, then that offers real promise for stratifying treatment based upon HPV status.
When you say de-escalating, do you mean like less rounds of radiation, or potentially
or fewer greys in those rounds? So the dose itself is lower, or potentially a slightly different treatment, so coupling a new kind of monoclonal antibody, perhaps with chemotherapy. Maybe there are lots of
research going on.
Yeah.
But that is great. I mean, as much as I guess as a patient you sort of go, oh, because you're like scared because you want to make sure you get all of the cancer. On the other hand, I think everyone listening, especially those who have gone through radiation and chemo, anything to reduce the long-term side effects to protect quality of life is a huge step forward.
It is. There is a danger that we need to keep you guys safe as well. So it needs to be done very carefully. And my argument would be that we need to know more about that basic science before we can do it sort of reliably and make sure that we are asking the right questions. But I would hope that it is on the horizon. Yeah.
Amazing. That's really exciting. And right, so we've already done Hannah and Vicky. So Steph Gayhart, she asks, why do some sources claim HPV isn't associated with oral tongue cancer, only base of tongue cancer? Do we know for certain?
The higher incidence is in the base of tongue and tonsils, because of that kind of skin structure, I suppose. But yes, we do know that it is elsewhere in the mouth, but the focus has been more on oropharyngeal cancer, so there are other sites, but we know less about them, I suppose.
And I guess to back that up, there's been research that has monitored the numbers on HPV positive versus negative, and there was that 90-10% split or thereabouts. Don't quote me on numbers. I am not good with numbers. There we go. Laura Marston asks, how does HPV vaccine prevent HPV-16, or is it just specific to HPV, or is it specific to HPV strains? So we did cover that a little bit, because you said the new vaccine covers 9 different strains.
Yeah, so the first vaccine, so this is UK. I only know the UK story. So the first vaccine was HPV-16 and 18, different types. We very quickly moved on to to 4 strains, so 16, 18, and then 6 and 11, which aren't cancer-causing types. They are the types most responsible for genital warts. And then now we're on the 9-valent, and I can't even remember, apologies, which 9 types are in there. But so there's another couple of cancer-causing types and another couple of
suspected cancer-causing
and non-cancer-causing types, but those types that still cause disease. And the virus is really neat. So it has two proteins that form the virion. So it's a sort of circular virus. And those and one of those proteins called L1, late 1, it kind of can come together in its own right to sort of form a virus. It just sort of self-assembles, a bit like my daughter plays with magnetiles. I don't know, how you can build structures and with things that stick together. So it sort of makes what we call VLPs, or virus-like particles. So they're empty particles, but with these L1 L1 proteins. And of course then the body's immune system recognises those and mounts that defence. So at the moment we have those VLPs that are for 16 and for 18 and 6 and 11, and then the other types in the 9-valent vaccine. And so our body then recognises those viral types, and then when you encounter them subsequently, it's already ready, it's already primed to attack that as foreign, and has that kind of armour ready to go. So it's a really neat system, actually.
That's amazing. So your interest or your passion surrounding HPV is very much related to the vaccine, I assume. Is that where your research? Not really.
So I am my main research questions that I have, and I have this remarkable team in the lab. Like, this isn't me doing this work. Like, I'm the one that sits in this office, you know. But they are in the lab, and they are asking the questions about that I sort of touched upon. You know, what is happening in an infection in the head and neck as opposed to the cervix, and trying to kind of support us to answer that.
Mm-hmm.
But and that's great, and I think it's fundamental, and it needs to be asked. And as I said, when I went to the IPVC conference a couple of weeks ago, it reassured me that we are asking the right questions, and that this research needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, it feels very removed from what you are experiencing and what people are experiencing, and so I feel myself more and more being called down a sort of public health route, and that actually I can make not more of a difference, that's the wrong choice of words, but that I can have a real impact by promoting things like the vaccine, by raising awareness, by talking about this, by trying to break down the stigma associated with the sexual transmission, for instance, as well, and the connotations that come with that are absolutely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so more and more I am putting time towards that. And hoping that I can have perhaps a faster and a more positive impact that way.
On patients. That's amazing. Thank you so much. I had another question pop up as you were talking. So you talked about the research questions that you're asking, which is how an HPV virus turns into a cancer in the head and neck, and how it differs from cervical cancer. How do you go about answering that question? Do you watch something? Do you infect something with an HPV? I don't know.
That is some work that I did do during my postdoc, actually, in Birmingham. We effectively grew skin in the lab, and we'd get keratinocyte cells, which are those skin cells that form that skin layer, from the mouth, and infect them with HPV. And there are some really cool groups that are doing that work over in the States as well, following up on that, with a woman who did a PhD with me while not with me, but in the same lab as me while we were doing that work. So that's super cool stuff, and it really will unpick a lot of those questions. But what we do is that we have tonsils that come to us from local hospitals, from just a routine tonsillectomy. Within adults, we don't have child tissues, juvenile tissues. So they're massive tissues as well. So it gives us an awful lot to play with, which is super cool from the science perspective. And we look to see if HPV is there, and we're using that PCR test that we've discussed as well. So once we then know whether HPV is there, then we start to pursue that. And we know from the pathologist that these tissues are non-cancerous. That's a criteria in my study. I mean, it's still worth asking those questions in cancer, of course, but from my perspective, I'm interested in the early infection, so before we have cancer. And then once we have those HPV versus HPV positive versus HPV negative tissues, we're then looking at the proteins that are expressed in those tissues, looking for changes that the virus is promoting before things become cancer. So we call that the pathogenesis of the virus. What, you know, that question of what is the virus doing. But also it enables us to ask the question, okay, and how is the host responding? What is the host doing? And that the host is us, obviously. And so we can look at it from both perspectives, from what the virus is turning on, and from how we're trying to counter that, and or potentially are we not able to counter it, and is that what helps the virus get ahead in that kind of battle of us versus virus.
My mind is blown. But I
work with some very, very talented people.
That's amazing. And you know, because we as a community we talk a lot like what can we do for science or for more research to take place, and we're as a community are looking into how we can, you know, from taking part in research and PPI groups and having our own PPI group, but also gathering data, you know, where there are gaps, and there's lots of gaps, to participating in biobanks. There's an awful lot for us what we can get involved with and can do, and I'm proud to say the Young Tongues have quite a few things coming up on that. I shall not say any more until I've signed contracts and things. But
I look forward to hearing your news.
Yes,
awesome. Absolutely awesome.
Thank you. So let's finish off with the question. What is, in terms of looking forward into the future, and we already talked quite a bit about different pieces of research, but what is the one that excites you the most?
So that vaccine efficacy that I have touched upon already really blows my mind. I mean, that's incredible. But I think in terms of the head and neck, I think one of the really interesting stories that will be coming out soon is about the immune system and that interplay in the head and neck, and how the immune system sees the virus. I think that's going to, well, I don't think we know that is very different to what is happening in the cervix. And that is going to be hugely significant in just in how this field develops, and that's in terms of treatment and so on, as well as that fundamental knowledge too. So yeah, that's something that I'm really looking forward to seeing develop.
Yeah, that's amazing. Elizabeth, thank you so much for spending an hour with us and sharing all of your knowledge and answering our questions. Really, really appreciate it.
Sorry, I can't answer that one.
No, but ultimately, I think, you know, as a community, we appreciate that. And we also know that, let's be honest, on the whole, research into this entire area of head and neck cancer is probably quite young and is really growing.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And what's really shocks me is that when Harold Zerhausen, who first described cervical cancer, described HPV as the causative agent of cervical cancer, rather, it was reported at the same time that they had observed HPV causing head and neck cancer, and yet that cervical field has just gone whoosh. And I suppose rightly so, because it's
more common cancer.
Exactly. But actually now we really need to be addressing what's happening in the head and neck and in other sites, and you touched upon anal cancer, that and penile cancer. You know, this, and to emphasize that this isn't just about women either. That, you know, this is about men as well, and that there is so much to come from this, and so much that needs to be done.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth, Thank you for being with us and thank you for your work. On that note, Young Tongues, thank you so much for listening in. Looking forward to having you back next week. If you would like to come on the podcast to share your story, or you know someone exciting and expert that we should have on the podcast, please email us on podcast@youngtonguesglobal.com. Make sure you give us a follow and a nice review, because we always like that. And on that note, I'll say thank you very much and have a fabulous week.